In the autumn of 1944, as the war in the West seemed all but won, a fierce and often overlooked battle unfolded on the fog-shrouded fields of Lorraine. Here, Patton's Third Army pushed deep into France, only to be met by fresh German Panzer brigades, eager to prove that Hitler's armoured fist could still crush any advance. With sleek Panthers prowling the countryside and American tank crews outgunned on paper, it looked like the tide might finally turn against Patton's bold thrust. But what followed was a savage contest of wits and nerves, Shermans and tank destroyers manoeuvring through thick mist, striking from unexpected angles, while Panthers fired back with deadly precision. It was a brutal test of leadership and raw fighting spirit, a lesser-known clash where Patton's forces would once again defy the odds and break the backbone of Germany's last armoured hopes in the West. This was Arracourt, a forgotten proving ground where the myth of German invincibility faced cold, stubborn American steel. For those well versed in the military history of the Second World War, a handful of iconic battles tend to dominate the public memory. The frozen ruins of Stalingrad, where entire armies bled out in a contest of wills. The thunderous clash of armour at Kursk, history's largest tank engagement. The desperate Ardennes winter offensive known as the Battle of the Bulge, and the North African struggle for supremacy at El Alamein. All of these echo through the history books. Yet, buried beneath these monumental confrontations are lesser-known battles that were no less fierce, no less pivotal, and in some ways even more tactically fascinating. One such battle was fought in the rolling countryside of northeastern France, in a place called Arracourt. The Battle of Arracourt, which unfolded between September 18th and September 29th, 1944, was a crucial and overlooked tank engagement between American and German forces in the Lorraine region. Taking place during the Lorraine campaign, this confrontation saw the US 4th Armored Division, under the command of Major General John S. Wood, face off against a hastily assembled German armoured thrust launched by Hitler in a last-ditch attempt to blunt the Allied momentum. The battle was not just another clash of armour, it was the largest tank battle the US Army had fought up to that point in the war. It ended in a decisive American victory, with 2 German Panzer brigades, along with additional elements from Panzer divisions, utterly dismantled and driven from the field. What makes the Battle of Arracourt so compelling is the remarkable imbalance between the opposing forces. The German assault was spearheaded by advanced Panther tanks, feared for their thick-sloped armour and long-barreled 75mm high-velocity guns, machines that, on paper, vastly outclassed the American M4 Shermans, most of which were still equipped with their standard 75mm guns. In theory, the Shermans stood little chance in a straight duel. But as the battle unfolded, it became clear that technology alone did not dictate the outcome of tank warfare. Tactics, terrain, weather, air support, and unit cohesion all played decisive roles. In September 1944, the situation on the Western Front was one of rapid movement. Following the breakout from Normandy, Allied forces had surged across France with astonishing speed. Paris had fallen, German resistance had splintered, and Patton's Third Army had driven east toward the German frontier, but such advances came with logistical strain, long supply lines, and overextended units. Sensing an opportunity, Hitler ordered a counter-offensive to strike at the flanks of Patton's army. The goal, to retake the town of Lunéville and cut off the American 12th Corps, which had established a bridgehead across the Moselle River at WWII. To carry out this mission, the German High Command assigned the task to the 5th Panzer Army, a formation with a storied combat history, including campaigns in Russia and Normandy. Under the overall command of General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most respected and capable armoured commanders, the Germans sought to deliver a swift and crushing counterblow near the quiet village of Arracourt. The local terrain, marked by open fields, patches of woodland and gently rolling hills, would soon echo with the roar of engines, the blast of tank guns, and the cries of wounded men. Combat Command A of the US 4th Armored Division, an element of Patton's famed spearhead, was positioned near Arracourt when the German attack began. These American tankers were no strangers to war. Many had fought their way through Normandy, across the Seine, and were hardened by months of intense combat. Yet they faced a grim reality. They were outnumbered in tanks and lacked the firepower of the Panthers they would soon confront. Still, what they lacked in raw power, they made up for in speed, coordination, and air superiority. The German 5th Panzer Army committed to this counter-offensive, the largest concentration of tanks seen in the West since the massive armoured battles around Caen and Mortain 2 months earlier. Over 300 tanks were assembled, many of them fresh from factories, forming the nucleus of newly created Panzer brigades. These brigades, a concept resurrected from the early days of the war, were originally designed as flexible, mobile formations to plug gaps in the front. Though intended primarily for the crumbling Eastern Front, Hitler now flung them west in a desperate attempt to regain the initiative. Each Panzer brigade was built around 2 armoured battalions, one typically equipped with the older Panzer IVs with long-barreled guns, and the other fielding the newer, heavier Panzer V Panthers. Though both carried similar 75mm guns, the Panthers had superior range, firepower, and protection. On paper, these were elite units, but in reality, many of the men inside them were raw recruits, rushed through training programs and deployed before their crews had achieved battlefield cohesion. These panzer units were brittle beneath the surface. Supporting the assault were 2 corps headquarters overseeing the operation and frontline divisions such as the 11th Panzer Division, which had a strong combat record stretching back to the Eastern Front and the Balkans. However, the 11th was a shadow of its former self, under strength and reeling from losses sustained in earlier campaigns. The real weight of the offensive fell on the newly formed 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades. While they had the advantage in hardware, their tactical acumen, radio discipline, and combat experience were sorely lacking. Meanwhile, the Americans held the high ground, literally and figuratively. Reconnaissance from the 4th Armored Division had detected German movements in advance. American artillery, well-positioned and highly responsive, was ready to react quickly to any enemy advance. The US Army's ability to coordinate between tank, infantry, and air units gave them a significant edge. Moreover, the dense morning fog that settled over Lorraine each day played a strange but critical role in shaping the battlefield, sometimes shielding the German advance, other times masking American movements. In this unpredictable environment, skill and adaptability would prove far more important than numbers on a spreadsheet. And so, the stage was set. In the still misted mornings of mid-September 1944, near the modest French town of Arracourt, a little-remembered but vitally important tank battle was about to begin. It would test not only the strength of steel, but the clarity of command, the courage of men, and the ability of armies to adapt in the crucible of war. What followed would leave nearly 300 German tanks destroyed or abandoned, and would forever stand as one of the greatest victories in US armoured warfare, despite being largely overshadowed by more famous campaigns. The German armoured formations, recently assembled in haste, were plagued by a host of serious shortcomings before the first shot had even been fired. Many of these issues stemmed from the speed with which the counter-offensive had been conceived and launched. With the Allies advancing rapidly through France, time was a luxury the Germans did not have. The newly formed Panzer brigades, intended to halt the momentum of Patton's Third Army, were rushed into action before their crews had time to undergo proper unit integration or field exercises. Fuel shortages, which had become increasingly critical following the loss of key refineries and Allied bombing campaigns, only made matters worse. Panzer crews had to conserve fuel even during their approach marches, and this logistical constraint meant that precious hours of training and maneuver rehearsals were forfeited entirely. As a result, the tank crews that rolled into the fields of Lorraine in September 1944 were inexperienced, undertrained, and largely unfamiliar with how to operate effectively in large-scale combined arms operations. While many of their vehicles were technically superior, particularly the Panther tanks, these advantages were undermined by poor tactical coordination and a chronic lack of reconnaissance. Many German tank commanders were not yet comfortable working with their accompanying infantry or artillery units, and their situational awareness on the battlefield was dangerously limited. Facing these fragile yet heavily armed formations was a force that had become one of the most formidable armored units in the US military. The 4th Armored Division of Patton's 3rd Army, led by the aggressive and unorthodox Major General John S. Wood. The division was a veteran formation with deep cohesion between its tank, infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance elements. These men had trained together since 1941, developing doctrine, discipline, and trust across every level of command. Since the breakout from Normandy in July, they had been engaged in almost continuous fighting, advancing, maneuvering, and engaging the enemy across hundreds of kilometers. Battle-hardened and alert, the 4th Armored Division was more than ready for a fight. However, readiness alone did not mean parity in firepower. Most of the tanks fielded by the 4th Armored Division were the standard M4 Shermans, equipped with short-barreled 75mm guns. These were reliable and numerous, but their armament struggled to match up against the more powerful guns mounted on German tanks. The Panzer IV's long-barreled 75mm weapon could outgun the Sherman at longer distances, and the Panther's high-velocity 42 gun could knock out a Sherman from over 2,000 meters, often before the American crews even had visual confirmation of their attacker. The Sherman's 75mm gun, on the other hand, could barely scratch the frontal armor of a Panther, even at dangerously close range. The asymmetry in firepower was a source of grave concern for many American tankers. One crewman reportedly said, "If you see a Panther and you're in a Sherman, you'd better be looking for a place to hide." Still, the Americans held one key advantage that would soon turn the tide of battle: tactical coordination and flexibility. They could call in artillery within minutes, rapidly reposition tank destroyers, and, when weather permitted, summon devastating air support from P-47 Thunderbolts. During the opening days of the German attack, however, even this vital advantage was temporarily taken away. Throughout September, a thick, damp fog routinely blanketed the Lorraine countryside during the early hours of the day. On the morning of September 18, 1944, the fog was especially dense. Visibility dropped to near zero in many areas, grounding American tactical aircraft and preventing the kind of reconnaissance and close air support that had become a cornerstone of Allied operations. The Germans seized the opportunity. Shrouded in the morning mist, their armoured columns advanced with impunity, moving into positions unseen and unchallenged from above. But what shielded them from Allied air power also blinded them to the terrain and the enemy ahead. Without adequate scouting forces or mobile reconnaissance elements, German tank commanders were effectively moving blind. They had little idea of where American forces were positioned, how strong they were, or where natural obstacles might lie. The newly formed Panzer brigades, already unfamiliar with the terrain and poorly trained in coordination, soon found themselves operating in scattered, piecemeal thrusts rather than the unified hammer blow envisioned by their commanders. The fog, while initially a gift, soon became a curse. The first major German assault came swiftly. On September 18th, the 111th Panzer Brigade struck at Lunéville, colliding with elements of the US 2nd Mechanized Cavalry Group and the reserve command of the 4th Armored Division. The Germans hoped to seize the town quickly and use it as a staging point to split the American line. However, the Americans responded with remarkable speed and aggression. Reinforcements were rushed in from both the 4th and 6th Armored Divisions, and fierce urban fighting erupted around the town. Over the course of several brutal engagements, the Americans managed to hold their ground and repelled the German advance, destroying more than 24 enemy tanks in the process. With the plan to take Lunéville in ruins, the Germans shifted their focus northward. Instead of grinding through reinforced American positions, they aimed to strike at what appeared to be a vulnerable American outpost, Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, positioned near the town of Arracourt. This area formed a salient, an exposed bulge in the American line, lightly held and poorly supported. The German High Command believed that a concentrated attack here could isolate the CCA, destroy it, and perhaps even force Patton to halt his advance altogether. The CCA's positions around Arracourt consisted of a stretched defensive line made up of armoured infantry, engineers and support units, all reinforced by a scattering of tanks, tank destroyers and artillery batteries. These units were alert, but thinly spread across a wide front. As the sun rose on the foggy morning of September 19th, 1944, the quiet was shattered by the sound of approaching engines. At 7:30, the lead elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade, hidden by the morning mist, emerged from the haze and slammed directly into the American line. The Germans struck with force, unaware they were launching into a trap. At that moment, CCA had only one forward company of M4 Shermans deployed to meet the attack. Behind them, held in reserve and carefully positioned in ambush, was a company of M10 tank destroyers, armoured vehicles equipped with high-velocity 76mm guns capable of piercing German tank armour if fired from the flank or rear. These tank destroyers, combined with artillery spotters already zeroed in on likely enemy approach routes, would soon unleash hell on the unsuspecting German formations. What was meant to be a swift breakthrough was about to become a desperate brawl in the fog, a clash not just of steel, but of tactics, timing, and nerve. The German 113th Panzer Brigade entered the fray with confidence, bolstered by a formidable array of armoured might. 4 full companies of Panther tanks formed the spearhead, their thick frontal armour and deadly 75mm guns intended to smash through any American resistance. Accompanying these were a company of assault guns, likely Sturmgeschütz 3 variants, designed to support infantry in close-quarter engagements. 2 battalions of Panzer Grenadiers, mounted in trucks and half-tracks, followed behind, ready to exploit any breakthrough. It was a classic German armoured assault, blitzkrieg reborn on the Western Front. This offensive was aided by the dense autumn fog that clung to the fields and hedgerows around Arracourt that morning. The mist served as a natural cloak, shielding the Panthers from the dreaded American fighter-bombers that had mauled German armour throughout the summer. For a moment, it seemed that fortune might favour the attackers. The Germans believed they held the element of surprise. But they were wrong. Though visibility was poor, American listening posts and forward observers detected the rumble of engines and the crackle of movement through the wet undergrowth. Combat Command A, already wary from the previous day's encounter, moved swiftly. Tank crews were roused, tank destroyers positioned, and artillery units adjusted their aim. This time, the fog would not favour the Germans, it would turn against them. As the German Panthers emerged from the haze, expecting to catch the Americans unprepared, they found instead a coordinated ambush, waiting in silence. American Sherman tanks, lying in wait behind tree lines, buildings, and small rises in the terrain, opened fire at close range, distances at which their 75mm guns could actually pierce the thinner side armour of the German tanks. The German advance quickly lost cohesion as one Panther after another was hit from the flanks. Within minutes, 11 Panzers were destroyed in rapid succession, burning wrecks now marking the place where fog had concealed their last moments. The core of the German problem was not just visibility, it was a complete lack of battlefield awareness. The 5th Panzer Army had been assembled hastily, and key reconnaissance units that normally provided critical intelligence were absent or unavailable. Without dedicated armoured scouts or forward observers, the Germans were effectively blind. Their tanks advanced in tight formations, unaware of enemy positions, and unaware of the kill zones they were driving straight into. On the American side, reinforcements from nearby infantry battalions, cavalry troops, and additional armour poured into the area, while the Germans stuck rigidly to their original attack plan, repeating thrusts along predictable routes. The Americans adapted quickly, repositioning units and exploiting the terrain. By the second day of combat, CCA had transformed the battlefield into a deadly network of overlapping fire zones, concealed gun positions, and artillery corridors. The Americans were now fighting on ground they had chosen, under conditions they had shaped. From these advantageous positions, US forces used textbook fire and maneuver tactics. Sherman tanks would engage and fall back, drawing German tanks into range of waiting M10 tank destroyers. Infantry squads with bazookas and anti-tank mines moved through hedgerows and farm buildings, setting ambushes and baiting the Panthers into deadly traps. Artillery batteries, some positioned miles away, rained down fire with pinpoint accuracy, coordinated through radio spotters, embedded with frontline units. A critical moment unfolded near the village of Lizy, where a platoon from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had been dispatched to support the American line. The unit took position in a shallow depression, waiting silently in the early morning fog. Suddenly they spotted the silhouettes of German tanks moving through the mist, unaware they had been seen. The M10s opened fire from just 150 yards away, point blank for anti-tank combat. Within seconds, shells slammed into the sides of the unsuspecting Panthers. In the firefight that followed, 3 of the 4 M10s were knocked out. But before they fell silent, they had destroyed 7 German tanks, a remarkable feat of sacrifice and timing. By the end of that day's fighting, the battlefield resembled more a scrapyard of burnt-out steel than a military engagement. The toll on the German 113th Panzer Brigade was staggering. Over 50 tanks had been lost, more than half of the unit's strength, along with scores of vehicles and men. The very force that had been expected to shatter the American line had been mauled, its attack blunted not by superior firepower, but by superior planning, flexibility, and terrain awareness. While the German tanks had the range and armor, they were unable to capitalize on these advantages. The fog that had shielded them from the skies also shortened engagement distances, neutralizing their guns' long-range superiority. Meanwhile, American armor was free to move and reposition, hidden until the last possible moment, then striking with devastating effect. Artillery and tank destroyers worked in concert to carve up the German formations piece by piece. Yet the battle did not end there. Between September 20th and 25th, the German 5th Panzer Army, still under pressure to achieve a breakthrough, launched a series of disjointed and increasingly desperate attacks. The depleted 111th Panzer Brigade and the understrength 11th Panzer Division were hurled back into the fight, ordered to renew the offensive against Arracourt at any cost. But the cohesion of the assault had broken down. Rather than a unified armoured punch, the attacks came as fragmented jabs, battalion-level thrusts launched in poor weather, on unfamiliar ground, with no clear intelligence about enemy strength or disposition. These continued German attacks only gave the Americans more opportunities to destroy tanks piecemeal. By now, the terrain around Arracourt was littered with wreckage, twisted metal, scorched chassis, and scorched fields told the story of a force that had misjudged both its enemy and the battlefield. For every Panther that made it through the mist, several never returned. And for the American soldiers dug in around Arracourt, the destruction unfolding before them was a testament to discipline, experience, and the importance of combined arms warfare. What had begun as a German counteroffensive designed to halt Patton's advance had, in less than a week, become a grinding slaughter, a defeat not just of machines, but of strategic vision and battlefield doctrine. On the morning of September 20th, the German offensive intensified. A concentrated push by Panther tanks struck directly toward the command elements of Combat Command A. As the German Panzers rumbled through the fog-laced fields, their advance isolated several vital support units of the US 4th Armored Division. These logistical elements, mechanics, fuel trucks, signal teams, were suddenly in the line of fire, caught behind the front without adequate protection. What had been a relatively stable rear area now faced the very real threat of being overrun. In the midst of this unfolding crisis, an unlikely hero rose into the air. Major Charles Carpenter, a US Army artillery spotter and reconnaissance pilot, took to the skies in his small Piper L4 Cub. It was an unassuming aircraft, an observation plane affectionately nicknamed Rosie the Rocketer, but Carpenter had modified his aircraft into something far more dangerous. Slung beneath its wings were 6 bazookas, portable anti-tank rocket launchers adapted for aerial use. Though primitive compared to dedicated attack planes, Carpenter's Cub had a secret weapon: surprise. That morning, thick clouds and lingering fog made visibility near impossible. Carpenter flew low, struggling to identify targets in the murky landscape below. But as the day wore on, the sky began to clear, revealing columns of German armour advancing through the countryside near Arracourt. Swooping down, dodging machine gun fire and rifle bursts from below, Carpenter unleashed all 6 of his rockets in a daring run against a German tank company he had spotted moving into position. But he was not finished. Carpenter returned to base, rearmed, and took off again, not once, but twice. Over the course of the day, he flew 3 sorties, each one as reckless and courageous as the last. All told, he launched 16 bazooka rockets against German armour and vehicles. Ground troops on the scene later confirmed the results. At least 2 Panther tanks destroyed, several armoured cars knocked out, and dozens of German soldiers killed or wounded. For a man flying what amounted to a canvas and wood scout plane, Carpenter had struck a staggering blow. His actions would become legendary, and Rosie the Rocketer would go down in history as one of the most unconventional tank killers of the war. By the next day, September 21st, the weather had fully turned. The skies cleared, the fog lifted, and the full might of the US Tactical Air Command was unleashed. The 405th Fighter Group, flying rugged Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, took to the air in waves. These aircraft, heavily armed with 8 50 caliber machine guns and underwing rockets, descended upon German columns like avenging angels. Strafing runs lit up the countryside, and bombs shattered German troop concentrations, fuel convoys, and tanks caught in the open. Where the fog had once protected the German advance, the sun now exposed them to annihilation from above. Still, the Germans pressed forward. On the morning of September 22nd, they launched yet another attack north of Arracourt, hoping once again to exploit the early fog for cover. They smashed into elements of American cavalry, lightly armed reconnaissance units tasked with screening the flanks and providing early warning. The cavalry troopers, knowing they stood little chance against the heavy German tanks, held their ground with remarkable discipline, buying critical time for CCA's main armoured force to reposition. Their sacrifice allowed the Americans to form a layered defensive line, tanks up front, tank destroyers in depth, artillery behind, and forward air controllers ready to call in strikes. Then, as if nature itself joined the battle, the fog began to lift. Suddenly, the battlefield was lit in full clarity. German tanks, which had been cautiously advancing under the veil of mist, were caught in the open. American Sherman tanks, M10 tank destroyers, and artillery batteries opened fire with devastating coordination. Radio communication linked every American asset into one cohesive machine of destruction. At the same time, P-47s swooped in from above, pounding German positions with rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire. What followed was nothing short of an inferno. The battlefield erupted into flame, steel, and smoke. Panzer Brigade 111 was torn apart in the chaos. German formations that had once confidently surged forward were now reduced to wreckage littering the fields. And the Americans did not stop there. As the Germans paused to regroup, exhausted and reeling from the ambush, a second wave of American tanks arrived, an understrength company of Shermans that had been rerouted to reinforce the front. Without hesitation, CCA counterattacked. Using the dissipating fog to their advantage, they launched a flanking assault that struck the Germans from the side, moving from north to south like a scythe through a field of grass. Caught between the defensive screen in front and the rolling wave of Shermans attacking their exposed flank, the remnants of the 113th Panzer Brigade were crushed. Their formations collapsed under the pressure, vehicles were abandoned, crews fled or were cut down, and German resistance disintegrated. What had once been a powerful armoured formation was now scattered wreckage and burning hulks. The fields north of Arracourt were choked with smoke and dotted with the shattered remains of Panther tanks. Hulking, steel giants brought low by precise tactics and superior coordination. One of the decisive factors in this American victory was the mobility and versatility of their armoured units. While the Panther boasted heavier armour and better guns, it was slower to traverse terrain, more prone to breakdown, and less capable of quick tactical shifts. American units, by contrast, operated fluidly. Tank destroyers could be rushed to any weak point. Artillery could be redirected within minutes, and air support could be summoned on demand. This network of coordination proved unbeatable in the dynamic, fog-covered fields of Lorraine. In just a few short days, 2 of Hitler's new Panzer brigades, designed as elite, mobile strike forces, had been shattered by an outnumbered but battle-tested American force. It was a textbook example of how superior training, flexibility, and combined arms warfare could overcome even technologically superior enemies. And for the German 5th Panzer Army, what had begun as a counterstroke to turn back Patton's advance was quickly becoming a disaster that echoed the failures of the Eastern Front, where terrain, weather, and logistical overreach had doomed so many offensives before. Among the many veteran units that fought under the 4th Armoured Division during the Battle of Arracourt, one stood out with exceptional distinction: the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by the relentless and future legend, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Aggressive, fearless, and tactically brilliant, Abrams had a reputation that echoed across Patton's Third Army. Under his command, the 37th became a hammerhead that struck deep into the German rear, spreading chaos and fear in every direction it moved. Between September 19th and 22nd, the Germans made multiple determined attempts to push Abrams and his battalion back across the Moselle River. It was here, in the fields and villages around the town of Moyenvik, that one of the largest and fiercest tank engagements of the Western Front would unfold. The battlefield became a churning cauldron of steel and smoke as Panthers and Tigers, supported by infantry and self-propelled guns, surged forward in waves, only to be met by the fast-moving and experienced Shermans of the 37th. The price was steep. Abrams' battalion lost 14 Sherman tanks in those brutal few days, but the cost to the enemy was catastrophic. In return, his men knocked out an estimated 55 German tanks, including some of the feared Tiger I heavy tanks. These were tanks that had once roamed the battlefield with near impunity. Now, they were burning wrecks, their reputations shattered. It was a masterclass in maneuver warfare. American units fluidly shifting positions, striking from unexpected angles, and using every fold of terrain to their advantage. By the end of this engagement, the German attempt to retake the ground east of the Moselle had failed completely. On September 22nd, the Shermans of the 37th roared south once again. Rolling through the villages of Arracourt and Bures, they pushed all the way to the Rhine-Marne Canal. Everywhere they advanced, they found traces of the collapsing German offensive, abandoned equipment, shattered armor, and confused pockets of resistance too disorganized to mount a real defense. The Wehrmacht, under orders to halt the American tide, hurled counterattack after counterattack at the US lines. But each German thrust was weaker than the last. With every Panther knocked out, with every crew lost, the tempo of the German assault slowed. Eventually, it faltered altogether. By the time the guns fell silent around Arracourt, 2 of Hitler's prized Panzer brigades had been effectively annihilated. In just under 2 weeks of combat, the 4th Armoured Division, despite being outgunned and facing supposedly superior tanks, had destroyed no fewer than 285 German tanks and armoured vehicles. In exchange, they had lost only 25 medium tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The ratio was staggering and the implications were clear. The myth of German armoured invincibility had been pierced, and the ability of American forces to coordinate air, ground, and mechanized elements had never been more evident. The aftermath of the battle brought General Patton's Third Army to the very doorstep of the Reich. With the enemy routed, the road to Germany appeared open, but then came a moment that still sparks debate among historians, a pause in the advance not caused by German resistance, but by Allied logistics and high command decisions. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower had decided to divert precious fuel supplies to British and Canadian forces driving toward the Netherlands in Operation Market Garden. As a result, Patton's tanks, mere kilometers from breaching Germany's frontier, were forced to halt and wait. The aggressive thrust eastward came to an abrupt standstill, not at the hands of the enemy, but because of empty fuel drums. This delay gave the battered German military a brief but critical window. During it, they were able to retreat in better order, consolidate their remaining forces, and regroup along the heavily fortified Siegfried Line, the western wall that marked the threshold of Germany proper. It was the first time since Normandy that the momentum of the American advance had been seriously interrupted. As for the Americans, the battle had proven more than just a tactical victory. It was a validation of their evolving approach to armored warfare. Central to that success was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. His calm under fire, his aggressive exploitation of enemy weaknesses, and his deep trust in his men cemented his legacy. He would go on to become one of the most revered American armored commanders of the war, later rising to the highest military position in the U.S. Army, Chief of Staff in the 1970s. In fact, the M1 Abrams main battle tank that still serves in the U.S. Army today is named in his honor. The Battle of Arracourt stands as the largest tank engagement involving U.S. forces on the Western Front until the Battle of the Bulge 3 months later. It remains a powerful lesson in how victory in armored warfare often hinges less on the raw specifications of machines and more on the quality of leadership, the training of crews, and the synergy between different arms of a modern military. Despite being outgunned, American forces had used terrain, intelligence, coordination, and sheer tenacity to deliver a crushing blow to one of Germany's last major armoured counteroffensives in France. The aftermath of the Battle of Arracourt sent ripples of frustration and dark realization through the German high command, shaking the already strained confidence in their armoured arm and exposing fatal cracks between field officers and Hitler's increasingly paranoid inner circle. For generals like Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army overseeing these attacks, and General Otto von Knobelsdorff of 1st Army, the disaster was both humiliating and infuriating, their staff scrambling to piece together after-action reports that laid bare just how badly the operation had been conceived and executed. Commanders on the ground, like Oberst Meinrad von Lauschert, though tactically adept, found themselves caught in a hopeless swirl of unrealistic directives from above, forced to hurl under-supported Panther formations piecemeal against seasoned American tankers who used every hedge, knoll, and fog bank to devastating effect. In the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's reaction was a poisonous mix of volcanic rage and cold, creeping distrust. The Führer lashed out at reports of Panthers knocked out by Shermans and Thunderbolts, refusing to accept that technical superiority alone could be defeated by American flexibility and firepower, and instead concluded his generals were either incompetent or insufficiently fanatical to carry out his will. His closest circle, figures like Jodl, Keitel, and even Guderian, found themselves fielding savage tirades that singled out the Panzer Brigade's failure as proof the traditional officer corps could not be trusted with independent initiatives. This only deepened Hitler's resolve to personally script the next major offensive, the coming Ardennes gamble, and it emboldened him to keep a tighter grip on operational planning. While Arracourt did not see mass purges or dramatic sackings on the spot, Germany could ill afford to cashier experienced commanders by late 1944, it did see reputations quietly tarnished. The concept of the hastily raised Panzer brigades, which had been Hitler's latest pet idea for quick armoured strikes, was swiftly discredited. Many of these formations were dissolved or absorbed back into depleted panzer divisions, a tacit admission of their failure. For the officers directly tied to these brigades, it was a professional stain that could not be scrubbed off, their reports overshadowed by the stark fact that nearly 100 irreplaceable German tanks had been lost in a matter of days for no lasting gain. More dangerously for the future, Arracourt's humiliation fed Hitler's bunker mentality. He became ever more convinced that only by micromanaging the war himself could Germany be saved, leading him to dictate the objectives, timetables, and even minor operational details of the Ardennes offensive months later, with catastrophic consequences. Thus, the wrecked Panthers smouldering in the French fields after Arracourt were more than just battlefield debris. They were silent witnesses to a regime tightening into fatal delusion, commanders increasingly shackled by Hitler's fear of disloyalty, and a German war machine that would soon drive itself over the cliff in Belgium under the weight of arrogance and denial. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's lesser-known but truly pivotal battles. If you found it as fascinating as I did, and you want more stories of fierce clashes, forgotten fronts, and the men who fought against impossible odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you never miss a new video. Drop a like if you enjoyed it and let me know your thoughts or what battles you'd like to see next down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.